The Monster Study: Why 22 Orphans Were Psychologically Tortured in Iowa. The letter arrived at the University of Iowa on a cold January morning in 2001. Mary Tudor's hands shook as she read it. After 62 years of silence, one of the orphans had found her. "Do you remember what you did to us?" the letter asked. "Do you remember making us monsters?" Mary Tudor did remember. She remembered everything. The stuttering children who weren't stuttering until she made them. The confident voices that became whispers. The bright eyes that went dark. She remembered because she had been the one holding the clipboard, writing down every broken word, every tear, every moment a child's spirit cracked. But Mary Tudor wasn't the monster. She was just the graduate student following orders. The real monster was waiting in his office at the University of Iowa, planning an experiment so cruel that his own colleagues would name it the Monster Study. An experiment on orphans. An experiment that would destroy children's lives to prove a theory. An experiment that would remain hidden for over 60 years. Dr. Wendell Johnson looked at the list of names. 22 orphans from the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home. Perfect subjects, he thought. No parents to complain. No one to protect them. No one to ask questions. They were already damaged goods, orphans that society had forgotten. What difference would one more experiment make? But here's what makes your blood run cold. Dr. Johnson knew exactly what he was doing. He wasn't trying to help these children. He was trying to break them, on purpose, with full knowledge, with meticulous notes. It started with a lie. In 1939, Mary Tudor drove to the orphanage in Davenport with a story about helping children speak better. The matron, believing the University of Iowa had the children's best interests at heart, gave her access to 22 children, 10 who stuttered, 12 who spoke perfectly. 6-year-old Mary Corlask was one of the 12 who spoke perfectly. She loved to talk, to sing, to tell stories to the younger children. Her teachers praised her clear speech. She was going to be adopted soon, they said. People liked children who spoke well. Mary Tudor sat down with little Mary Corlask and smiled. Then she destroyed her life with 8 words. "You have started to stutter, dear." But wait, there's more to this nightmare. Dr. Johnson's theory was simple and horrifying. Stuttering was learned behavior, not physical. To prove it, he would create stutterers. He would take normal-speaking orphans and psychologically torture them until they developed speech problems. He called it negative therapy. The children in Group IIA, the normal speakers chosen for destruction, were told they showed signs of stuttering. Every time they spoke, Mary Tudor interrupted them. "You're stuttering again. That's not right. You're getting worse. People will laugh at you. You'll never speak normally." 8-year-old Norma Jean Pug tried to explain she wasn't stuttering. Mary Tudor wrote in her notes, "Subject continues to deny speech defect. Increased pressure applied." Increased pressure. That's what they called telling an 8-year-old girl that everyone could hear her defect, that she was embarrassing herself, that she should stop talking before people noticed how damaged she was. Within weeks, Norma Jean stopped talking altogether. Here's the part that should terrify every parent. The experiment worked exactly as planned. The children who spoke normally began to stutter, not because of any physical condition, but because they were psychologically tortured into it. Their confidence was systematically destroyed by an adult they trusted. 11-year-old Philip Speaker was one of the older subjects. He fought back at first, insisting his speech was fine. Mary Tudor's notes from Session 3, subject resistant to suggestion, increased emphasis on peer perception of defect. She told Philip that other children were laughing at him behind his back, that teachers were discussing his problem, that potential adoptive parents had noticed his stuttering and decided against him. None of it was true. Every word was calculated psychological abuse. By Session 5, Philip had developed a stutter. But Dr. Johnson wanted more data. It wasn't enough to create stutterers, he needed to document their destruction in detail. Mary Tudor was instructed to record everything: the way children covered their mouths when speaking, how they avoided eye contact, the tears, the silence, the moment each child broke. Betty Romp was 9 years old and loved poetry. She would recite verses for anyone who would listen. After 4 sessions with Mary Tudor, Betty was found hiding in a closet, practicing words alone where no one could hear her mistakes. She never recited poetry again. The most heartbreaking part: the orphans trusted Mary Tudor. She was from the university. She was there to help. When she told them they had problems, they believed her. When she said they were getting worse, they accepted it. They were orphans. They were used to adults knowing better. Meanwhile, Dr. Johnson was back at the university, excitedly sharing his preliminary results with colleagues. He had done it. He had proven stuttering could be induced purely through psychological means. His theory was correct. Science had been advanced. One colleague, horrified by what he heard, gave the experiment its name: the monster study. Even in 1939, even in an era with fewer ethical guidelines, other researchers knew this was wrong. This was monstrous. This was evil dressed up as science. But the experiment continued for 6 months. 6 months of systematic psychological abuse. 6 months of destroying children who had already lost everything. 6 months of creating disabilities that would last a lifetime. Here's what they don't want you to know: the experiment included a control group that makes it even worse. Group IA contained orphans who actually stuttered. Half received positive therapy, encouragement, support, praise for their efforts. The other half, they got the same treatment as the normal speakers: constant criticism, interruption, humiliation. The stutterers who received positive therapy improved dramatically. Their speech became clearer. Their confidence grew. It proved that supportive therapy worked. But Dr. Johnson didn't care about helping the stutterers. He only cared about creating new ones. Orphan Hazel Potter was in the positive therapy group. For the first time in her life, an adult told her she was doing well, that her speech was improving, that she should keep trying. Decades later, she would say those 6 months with Mary Tudor were the only time anyone at the orphanage showed her kindness. The tragic irony: Mary Tudor knew how to help. She was helping half the children while destroying the other half. She watched confidence bloom in one room, then walked next door to crush it in another. She gave hope with one hand and stole it with the other. But the cover-up is almost as shocking as the experiment. When World War II ended, news of Nazi medical experiments horrified the world. Dr. Johnson realized his monster study would never be accepted now. The comparison was too obvious: experimenting on society's most vulnerable, creating suffering for science, using those without power as laboratory animals. So he buried it. The dissertation was hidden. The data was locked away. Mary Tudor was instructed never to speak of it. The orphans were left with their manufactured stutters and no explanation. The experiment that destroyed their lives officially never happened. But trauma doesn't disappear just because paperwork does. Mary Corliss grew up stuttering, never knowing why. Job interviews terrified her. Phone calls were torture. Relationships failed because she couldn't express herself. She spent thousands on speech therapy that barely helped because her problem wasn't physical. It was a psychological wound inflicted when she was 6 years old. Norma Jean Pug became selectively mute. The girl who had loved to talk now communicated in gestures and written notes. She never married, convinced no one would want someone who couldn't speak properly. She died alone, still believing she was defective. Philip Speaker's stutter followed him into the military. His fellow soldiers mocked him. Officers passed him over for promotions, saying he couldn't give orders clearly. The confident boy who had insisted his speech was fine became a man who apologized for every word. Here's where it gets even darker. In 1988, a graduate student named Rosalie Seaman was researching stuttering and stumbled across references to a study at an Iowa orphanage. Intrigued, she started digging. What she found horrified her. The monster study was real. The victims were still alive, and no one had ever told them the truth. But when Seaman tried to publish her findings, she hit walls. The University of Iowa didn't want this story told. Dr. Johnson was a respected name in speech pathology. Mary Tudor was still alive. Reputations were at stake. The Orphans. They didn't matter any more in 1988 than they had in 1939. It took until 2001 for the story to break. Jim Dyer, a journalist at the San Jose Mercury News, had been tipped off by a speech pathologist who couldn't stay silent anymore. When Dyer started investigating, he found the survivors. They were in their 70s now, still stuttering, still wondering why they had been cursed with speech problems. Mary Corlesk was working in a factory when Dyer found her. She had spent her entire life avoiding jobs that required speaking. When he told her about the experiment, she broke down crying. "So I wasn't born wrong?" she asked. "They did this to me." But here's what really breaks your heart. When the survivors learned the truth, they didn't feel relief. They felt rage. Decades of shame, isolation, and struggle could have been avoided. The children who couldn't get adopted because of their stuttering. The jobs they couldn't take. The relationships they couldn't pursue. All of it was manufactured by a professor who wanted to prove a point. The University of Iowa's first response: denial, then minimization. It was a different time, they said. Ethical standards were different. Dr. Johnson was a pioneer in speech pathology who helped thousands. But documents surfaced showing the university knew. Internal memos from the 1940s discussed the unfortunate experiment. Faculty meetings included debates about whether to destroy the records. They knew it was wrong. They knew children had been harmed. They covered it up anyway. In 2003, 6 survivors sued the state of Iowa. Their lawyer argued that the experiment constituted torture under any definition. The deliberate infliction of psychological harm, the targeting of vulnerable children, the lifelong disabilities created for academic curiosity. The state's defense was exactly what you'd expect. Too much time had passed. Statute of limitations. No proof of lasting harm. As if 7 decades of stuttering wasn't proof enough. Here's the kicker. During the lawsuit, more truth emerged. The experiment was even larger than the published records showed. More children were involved. Other orphanages were considered. Dr. Johnson had wanted to expand the study but was stopped only by the war. Letters were found from Mary Tudor to Dr. Johnson expressing doubts about the experiment. "The children seem to be getting worse," she wrote in 1940. "Should we stop?" His response was one line: "Continue as planned. We need more data." More data. That's all these orphans were. Data points in a professor's career. Statistics in a theory about stuttering. Not children who deserved protection, but subjects who provided information. The case was settled in 2007 for $925,000 divided among the 6 survivors. The state admitted no wrongdoing. The university expressed regret but not apology for destroying children's lives, for conducting human experimentation, for covering it up for 60 years. They paid roughly $150,000 per victim. But money can't undo trauma. Mary Corlesk used her settlement to pay for more speech therapy. At 75 years old, she was still trying to undo what was done to her at 6. It didn't work. The psychological scars were too deep. She died in 2019, still stuttering, still ashamed of speaking. Philip Speaker couldn't bring himself to cash the check. "It's blood money," he said. "They think they can pay us off and make it go away." He donated it to a stuttering foundation, hoping other children could get the help he never received. Dr. Wendell Johnson died in 1965, honored and respected. His obituary called him a pioneer in speech pathology. No mention of the monster study. No mention of the orphans. He spent his career studying stuttering, built on the foundation of children he had deliberately damaged. Mary Tudor died in 2009 at the age of 94. She had spent the last years of her life apologizing to anyone who would listen. "I was 24 years old," she would say. "I thought I was helping science. I didn't know. I didn't think." But she did know. Her own notes showed she watched those children break and kept going. Here's what nobody talks about. The monster study succeeded in its goal. It proved that stuttering could be induced psychologically. This finding actually helped develop better treatments for real stutterers. The field of speech pathology advanced because of what was learned. But at what cost? 22 orphaned children sacrificed for science, lives destroyed for data, disabilities created for a dissertation. When does the end stop justifying the means? The Iowa Soldiers' Orphans home closed in 1975. The building still stands, converted into apartments. Residents sometimes report hearing children's voices in the halls stuttering, stammering, struggling with words that won't come out right. Just echoes, they say, just the wind. But Norma Jean Pug's niece knows better. She lived with her aunt for years, watching her struggle with selective mutism. "Those aren't echoes," she says. "Those are the voices they stole." The real horror of the monster study isn't just what happened in 1939. It's that it could happen again. Vulnerable populations still exist. Researchers still push boundaries. Institutions still protect their own. The only difference is we're supposed to have learned better. Have we, though? In 2018, news broke about psychological experiments on migrant children in detention centers. In 2020, reports surfaced of drug trials on foster children without proper consent. In 2023, investigations revealed behavioral modification programs in juvenile facilities that mirror the monster study's techniques. Different decades, different victims. Same pattern: find those without power, experiment on them, hide the results when public opinion shifts. Dr. Patricia Zebrowski, now at the University of Iowa, teaches ethics in research. She uses the monster study as a cautionary tale. "It shows how easy it is to dehumanize subjects," she says. "How quickly advancing science becomes more important than human dignity." But she also admits a troubling truth. The university still benefits from Dr. Johnson's research. His theories, built on the suffering of orphans, are still taught. His papers, minus the monster study, are still cited. We use knowledge gained through torture while condemning the torture itself. This is where you come in. Every time research involves vulnerable populations, prisoners, orphans, the disabled, minorities, someone needs to ask, is this the monster study again? Are we creating harm to prove a theory? Are we choosing subjects because they can't refuse? The 6 survivors who sued weren't just seeking money. They wanted recognition. They wanted their story told. They wanted to ensure no other children would be experimented on like they were. They wanted the monster to be named. Because that's what it was: monstrous. Not a study, not an experiment, not a research project. It was the systematic psychological torture of orphaned children by educated adults who knew better. The orphans of the monster study are almost all gone now. Their stutters died with them, but their story remains as a warning. This is what happens when we forget that research subjects are human beings. This is what happens when advancing science matters more than protecting the vulnerable. This is what happens when we become monsters in the name of knowledge. Wendell Johnson spent his career asking why people stutter. But the real question is, why did anyone let him find out this way? The answer is as disturbing now as it was then, because they were orphans, because they didn't matter, because no one was watching. Someone should have been watching. Someone should always be watching. Are you watching? The monster study files are now public. You can read Mary Tudor's notes, see her document each child's destruction. You can trace the moment Betty stopped reciting poetry, when Philip developed his stutter, when Norma Jean chose silence over speech. It's all there in careful handwriting. the creation of disabilities, the manufacture of suffering, the breaking of children, recorded like a recipe for future researchers to follow. And that's the final horror. They were proud of their work. They thought they were pioneers. They believed history would vindicate them. They never imagined a world where experimenting on orphans would be seen as monstrous. But we see it now. We name it for what it was, and we promise, or we should promise, never again. The orphans of the monster study couldn't speak for themselves. Their voices were stolen. Their words were turned into weapons against them. But their silence speaks louder than any stutter. It says we were children. We deserved protection. We mattered. They did matter. They do matter. They will always matter. More than any experiment, more than any theory, more than any advancement in science. They mattered. Remember that.